Well, I thought just before we do begin on Romans, we want to talk a little bit about current events because it's only 24 hours, isn't it, until Britons vote on whether they will remain in the EU or not. And I know we had a lecture about this on Sunday, so I've just got maybe 5 minutes of points to make on it, just because we're nearer to the event than we were on Sunday. Up until a couple of weeks ago, you might have known that it seemed to be like a sure thing, that the majority of voters would vote Britain out of the EU. Until, of course, the assassination of Joe Cox, this British politician near Leeds, and now the country appears to be split 50-50. That might also be because it's easier to stay with what you know than to jump off the cliff into the unknown. And so even apparently bullish people might think twice and breathe deeply before they vote to exit the EU. So for a number of reasons, as we get up toward the final day, you could see the whole issue becoming a lot more 50-50 than perhaps it once was in the past. And the fact is everybody's worried. George Sorossi, who you might know, a billionaire financial speculator, currency speculator actually, said that financial markets in the world are now bracing themselves for Black Friday. Well, of course, tomorrow in the UK is the vote, and Friday, he says, will be Black Friday. Now, what he means by that is he expects if the Brits vote to leave the EU, it'll crash the pound. That is to say, it'll devalue the pound sterling, which will be a big problem in London. The European Council President, this is the ex-Polish Prime Minister, a fellow called Donald Tusk, says, if Britons leave the EU tomorrow, it could be the beginning of the end for the EU and for Western political civilization. Now, that might sound very alarmist, but his point is this will likely begin a domino effect because Britain is not the only country that's talking about leaving the European Union. The problem is, you see, Europe's got some problems. She's got some big problems. She's got a big debt problem. She's got a big migration problem. And there's political instability all across the Union. And you might say, well, yes, but financial markets will recover, which of course is true. Europe will reorganise, which of course is true. Britain will simply go and forge deeper trading relationships with the young lions, which of course is true. Donald Trump, in fact, is in the UK next week, of all things, to open a golf course in Scotland, but he's coincided his visit with the referendum because he supports Britain leaving the EU. And in an interview that he had with CBS News, he said, the question was posed to him, where would Britain stand in relation to the US if they leave the EU? And he said, they certainly wouldn't be at the back of the queue. So if he becomes the next president of the United States, you might expect to see greater ties forged between him and Britain than there might otherwise have been if Britain stayed in the EU. The big problem, however, if Britain leaves the EU, that is the big problem for the EU, is defence. I mean, we've got all sorts of financial speculation going on about what may or may not happen. There's no speculation about the defence problem Britain causes. You see, alongside France, Britain is the only other country with a sizable expeditionary military force, the only other country with nuclear weapons and a United Nations Security Council veto. She's a very big player in the EU in relation to defence. The point is, if Britain leaves the EU can't defend itself. That's a big problem, particularly in the face of a migrant crisis. The Wall Street Journal made this interesting comment. There is at least one place in Europe, however, where a British exit from the EU would be applauded. Where do you think they were talking about? One place in Europe where a British exit from the EU would be applauded, and that's in the Kremlin. And you can almost hear the bear licking his chops as he waits for Britain to leave the EU, because if they have a defence problem, who is it that's going to step in to fill that void? Well, only the Russians, of course. And if there has to be a reorganisation of the EU away from American-centric lines and back toward a more European-focused organisation, who will it be that seriously tries to influence those politics? Of course, Mr. Putin. And of course, that's exactly what we would expect to see, isn't it? But there's just two things to bear in mind, however. The first one is this. This referendum is not binding. So if the Brits do vote to leave the EU, David Cameron doesn't have to do it. Now, you've got to believe it's going to be political suicide if the majority of the country wants to leave and he decides he's not going to. But of course, he could stall it. I mean, they're talking about an amicable divorce. Britain's been in the EU since 1973, so it's not a straightforward thing to just leave. They've got to negotiate or renegotiate a whole lot of treaties as they leave, and the Europeans don't want them to take any more money with them than they can afford. The other thing is, even if Britain doesn't vote to leave the EU tomorrow, she will eventually do it. Bear in mind that as far as Bible prophecy is concerned, the only thing that must happen is that Britain must be out of the EU by the time Russia invades Israel. That is, by the time Ezekiel 38 is fulfilled. If Brother Thomas is right and Christ came tonight, Armageddon's not for 10 years. So either Britain's going to leave the EU tomorrow, or sometime in the next year or two after that as they negotiate their way out, or sometime a little later on in the next decade. Either way, if you could see Russia invading the Middle East in the next decade, then Christ is obviously at the door. This is a major signpost, brothers and sisters and young people, heralding the soon return of our Lord Jesus Christ. And I've got to believe that all the instability and chaos that might be caused around the world as a consequence of Britain leaving the EU, as far as the world is concerned, do you think God really cares about individual people in the world, that they might lose their superannuation, that they might lose their jobs? Not really, not a great deal. This is a wake-up call for Christadelphians. These sorts of things happen are simply birth pains warning Christadelphians to shape up and to take their lives seriously, because Christ is soon going to be here.